Mind control requires that every angle of your reality is manipulated. Manipulated in order to maintain an ongoing space similar to when you're knocked out, to be in a daze, to be in a constant haze that will maintain consciousness to some degree on some level, but really only enough to maintain your basic functions. So our basic functions here in this reality are focused on the physical reality. So if you want to control the entire reality, you have to control the most basic level of their function. In order to maintain that control, you have to emphasize their level of lack and provide that space, provide the fillers that fill that space of what you convince those masses they are lacking of. So we are convinced that we are less than human, whatever that is, first of all, because the definitions still come from your mind manipulators. Less than human when I say that when you believe that you come from monkeys, you're at your core just an animal. So you're at your basic animalistic needs, and your human definitions, your human expressions are more anchored in the animal reality and less reflective of the non-physical versions of who and what you are. This is why ancient cultures who were highly aware of their non-physical versions of themselves, their expressions of what is now known as the God nature. This is why those cultures, those think tanks, have to be demonized and labeled as primitive and savage. This is to maintain a space of hierarchy based upon false time. The way we keep track of time is also manipulated by the same mind manipulator. So you can see every angle, every definition, your definition of yourself, your definition of your past, your definition of your present, your definition of your future, your definition of time, even your name is of a slave master. How many people are walking around right now with their slave masters from 7 generations back or even less than that? This all affects your moment and your futures and what we accept as normal, what we accept as okay. The main thing to do is to disconnect you from your fully empowered expressions of yourselves in order to maintain codependency through your lower versions of yourselves. This is not to put the non-physical version on a pedestal as separate from the physical, only to emphasize that there is a non-physical version of our reality that exists, because that version of reality basically doesn't exist in the mainstream interpretations of who we are, which is why religion has been installed into the mainstream mindset in order to create a static, another version of separation, a version of acknowledging to some degree, but really only existing to maintain confusion. So the more and more you are divided and conquered with your own definitions of yourself, the easier it is to maintain mind control and codependency of not only the individual, but of masses of people. So you can see this with what happens in the Stockholm syndrome when a kidnapper kidnaps a kid or even adult. They maintain this space of lacking of their resources, lacking of their connections to their family, lacking of even their memories of who and what they are, creating a new version of who they are. So they have been divided from who and what they are in order to be conquered by their conquerors. To be in a constant state of war is to be in a constant state of animalistic expressions. It also maintains a sense of codependency because you are always in a state of fear. You're always in a state of needing to be protected, which is codependency, needing to be protected because of the fear that was installed by the people who are making money off of the war. Today's version of war is no different than animals maintaining territory. By the definitions of modern human, the only so-called humans that are expressions of the animalistic version of humanity are the ones who are following the colonial mindset, because the colonial mindset is the mindset of animalistic territorial conquering. It's the expansion of that belief system to where before that that wasn't the norm. Wherever we were, we maintained our space where we were. To venture out and conquer, there's a reason behind that. This is what I'm getting into with the relationship. The reason behind the moving around the world to conquer is to maintain time, because of, you can see nowadays people are talking about so-called white people are not reproducing at a rate that will maintain their bloodline. They're not reproducing enough based upon how many of them are passing over time. So basically they're becoming extinct faster. This was known back in the day, and in order to slow that timeline down, our reproductive cycles needed to be affected. So this is where eugenics came in. This is where the belief systems that were the foundation of white supremacy. In order to make police officers not give a shit about our lives, they had to have had generations of beliefs that we are of little to no purpose, that we are animals, that we are less than human. These are the reasonings behind white supremacy. It doesn't exist just because, you know, people are a certain way. There is a science behind white supremacy. And if you go into the ISIS papers and what a lot of these teachers have been speaking about for years, the science behind white supremacy is heavily based on reproduction. A good example of this is the great equalizer in the ISIS papers, what Dr. Francis Cress Welsing was talking about. The gun on the side of the hip of the police officer is referred to as the great equalizer, being in the shape of a penis in order to maintain the equal space of these people are a threat to our survival. So we need to create something that will be a threat to their survival. This is the science behind why there even is a Black Lives Matter movement out there. Not to say any kind of support to the Black Lives Matter, because that's all just like a democratic colonial mainstream movement. But the fact that that could even be a thing and be needed out there, be a statement to be said, there's a science behind that. And this is another reason why I separate myself, and a lot of people separate themselves from these mainstream movements, is because they're not going deep into the reasons of why. They're not going into the science of why Black lives have to matter, which is the whole point. They're only going in to the shallow versions, the political versions of these events that are happening on the streets with police, with Karens that are out there, with all kinds of people who are just living and believing certain things based upon what they have been programmed over centuries. There's a science behind it. But when it gets politicized, it turns into another weapon used to maintain a deeper level of mind control. So the science behind the depopulation programs that are out there are not limited to the governments installing weapons into the inner city communities, the drugs being installed into the inner city communities, the poor education systems, the separating of the families by demonizing the men and making women a certain way, promoting women to act a certain way and be a certain way and think a certain way. Same thing with men. It's not just the emphasizing of the LGBT community and making that part of other movements in order to make that movement bigger. And it's not just that. It's in the very nature of our beliefs and our definitions of who and what we are. What I wanted to do with this video is to emphasize how the very nature of our relationships, specifically the relationship between a man and a woman, in comparison to the older traditions of polygamy where you had a man and multiple women. This is just me over a number of months just analyzing and researching and just thinking about how things are the way they are and how things were, and just asking myself, okay, well, what are the benefits of a polygamous group compared to the benefits of a man and a woman raising a family? And when I was finished taking all the emotion out of the analysis, you'll realize that the majority of a singular family, just a man and a woman and the children, ultimately is very weak and very centered on the romanticizing of relationships. It has little to nothing to do with the macro relationship that we have with each other and nature overall. And when you look at how it was connected back in ancient cultures, the functionality of a bigger group is much more healthier. Because I started to ask myself, this was a while back, how relationships in general, because we can already see, like with the marriage programming, like marriage, anything promoted by the mainstream is going to be for a counterproductive purpose against the people, in order to be a productive purpose for the mind controllers in the system overall. So how is that with marriage and reproduction? Like I've gone into this many different times. It's mostly based upon codependency. When you have a man and a woman together living in the American dream, they want to have kids. They're programmed to have kids and reproduce. That's jumping on top of the natural function that we have to reproduce, which is co-opted by the system and now installed into this codependency program, because in order to have children, you have to provide for those children. You have to have a house, you have to have transportation, you have to provide them with food, education, so on and so forth. And everything that I just listed off is controlled by the system itself. So it feeds itself through your natural function. Our natural function back in the day wasn't this Saturn ring on your left finger, church-based, get the approval of the state relationship thing. Once you start piecing together like the reasons for being married. Nowadays, a lot of people do it for financial purposes, which is completely, that's just a lesser version. That's even more a less needed version than romanticism, because that's based upon the system itself. So the romanticism that's within modern relationships is already extra. You don't need it. Just like the deeper sort of, oh, we're twin flames. Oh, we're all, this is this cosmic union. This is all the romanticizing. Sex itself is purely a biological function. Everything else that's added beyond that is pleasure. Everything else beyond that is another version of romanticism. So you have a biological function and then you have pleasure. None of that is a requirement for the relationship. In fact, a relationship isn't a requirement at all. It's all a romanticizing of the experience overall. We add on through storytelling, through the movies, through the books, through everything that has been pushed by modern Western civilization. This is why these stories are told heavily over and over again. This is why movies are basically just the same script over and over again. They're telling you different things. This is why in action movies, in comedy movies, you always have to have some kind of romantic storyline that holds it all together, because it vests you into the story. You become that man who falls in love with that woman. You become that woman who falls in love with that man, or whatever the story is telling you. So you're invested through that mind program into the movie, into the script. You become one with that storyline, and this is when people start to say, oh, this is my favorite movie, and so on and so forth, because they become part of that story. So the premise was, when I asked myself, what are the benefits of promoting just a singular family, a man and a woman and a family? Well, obviously the codependency on the system. But beyond that, in order to maintain control and codependency on a larger scale, on the macro scale, I had this question of, well, which is more powerful? A man and a woman, or a couple, or an entire clan? Sections of groups, a family dynamic, a family group. That's when I connected it to something that I've said in many different previous videos, to where the American dream programming maintains this king and queen dynamic, to where you basically try to reproduce what the system is doing. You reproduce the space of your own castle, then you have to protect that castle. You are the king, and you have to protect your king, your queen, and your loyal followers and your family and all that other stuff. You have to protect your kingdom, and in protecting your kingdom, in order to do that, you have to buy into the codependency program of the kingdom that you are a reflection of. So on a macro scale, you can see that in maintaining the focus on just a man and a woman, that what they call a nuclear family, that actually creates another version of divide and conquer on a mass scale. because you have individual families who are separating themselves on a smaller scale from other family units. Whereas when you have larger family units, say a man and 5 wives, or even 3 wives, 4 wives, there's something that unifies family units that are bigger. There's more of a balance because there's less emotion when you have the feminine and masculine balances in that relationship. It's less singular and more holistic. When you have that more holistic expression on group settings, on family dynamics, that creates a power, that creates a strength that is not accessible in a smaller unit. So when you have many different groups of bigger groups as opposed to just couples, that makes, I'll put it in military terms. So you go from a squad to a platoon, to a company, to a battalion, to a brigade, and an entire post. Like you have an entire post of a couple or a few brigades and even more battalions and even more companies and even more platoons. So basically what it is which is stronger, a company or a squad? Would you rather go into war with a company of soldiers or a squad? Would you rather go into a war with a brigade or just a single company? You would want a brigade because a brigade is built up of many different companies, many different battalions. So the same thing goes for in relationships. The system knows that a strong, well-informed, and intelligent mass of people is a threat to their dominion, to their rule. So in that system, would they want you to unify as a company or a squad? Would they want you to unify as a battalion or a team? So on a tactical scale, that's the benefit of installing that mind control, that belief system into the masses and then making it the norm. Movies, like I said, movies, books, the fairy tale version of reality, which is basically the romanticizing part of the mind control program, it just emphasizes the singular unit in order to maintain control. On the reproductive scale, this also maintains slower reproductive numbers over time because you have smaller units. You have people reproducing on squad level instead of battalion level. This is a benefit to people who are losing numbers rapidly over years. When you have so many smaller units, you also have more of an ability to divide and conquer those smaller units because people have the ability to separate themselves from other smaller units. It also makes it harder for people to come together and unify on any kind of subjects, on any kind of topics. This is why you have so many people who are completely in the dark with what's going on massive scales, because they're consciously keeping themselves from looking at that information because they are focused only on their family. You'll see this all the time. Oh, I have to focus on this. I have to focus on this. My family, my family. They're not looking like the ancient cultures were 7 generations out and 7 generations behind. They're not looking out there. They have been conditioned to focus only on today. They have been conditioned to focus only on their singular unit, not realizing that if they don't look into the 7 generations ahead and the 7 front end from the 7 generations behind them, if they don't look into that information and take that into account, it will be a direct threat to their singular unit right now that they claim to be protecting. In the singular unit reality, you also create and emphasize this gigantic ego between the individuals and even the family, to where you have these tiny little castles and you have and people just walking around thinking they have an entire grasp on reality, that you basically create a space of walking egos, walking know-it-alls. And when you have walking know-it-alls, there's no reason to fight the system because they have everything that they need. And when you have the previous generations, like the parents and the grandparents, who are conditioning the kids and the grandkids to be just like them, then that's their version of maintaining mind control of generations in the future based upon generations of the past. This is why there is no separation between the church and the state. The glue that is between the church and the state is the relationship that the people have to the church and the state. You can't get married unless you have the approval of the state. Where do you get married? In the church. Why do politicians have to put their hand on a Bible or some kind of holy book in order to be representative of the people? It's all a mind control. No, those books are in those political unions of the politicians in order to maintain the relationship that the people have with the state, the codependent relationship that the people have with the state and the church. This is how it all comes together. The people are the glue between the church and the state. So I've already explained the tactical breakdown of maintaining smaller units as opposed to larger units. Now you can look at the downsides of smaller units in comparison to larger units. Look at the depression rate. Look at how dysfunctional family units are today. Look at how the way the system is designed affects the family units. All the work, all the time that the parents have to spend at work while the kids are in the public schools getting mind control there. You have people who are raised by babysitters. People, and less than that, people who are raised on the television. Time stealers. Healthy relationships, healthy unions are not a part of modern relationships. Survival is a part of modern relationships. When you have just the man and the woman, especially nowadays, we can see how the homeless rate and how people are struggling just to survive. Nowadays, even with the way the system is today, it's damn near impossible for a man and a woman to live comfortably the way the system is designed. And that's on purpose. Because the more in a depressive state, the harder it is for you to function, the harder it is for you to survive, the more inclined you are to be codependent on the system. When you are so deeply codependent on the system, this is where all the depression comes in. This is where all the separation between the parents and the children comes in. This is where all the emotional baggage starts to add up. And you have the family dynamics imploding on themselves just to survive. That implosion of the entire family unit also creates codependency. When the family unit implodes, the individuals implode. So the children are going to implode. And then they will create all of these different psychological problems that they will carry on into adulthood and into their families. Then they will get connected with another person who already has the problems that they're dealing with and have never fixed. They will create another unit and then continue on that process. Passing down the line the mind controls of codependency and self-destructive behavior. On the positive side, when you have like a battalion family structure, you have all of these different women with these different personalities and these different functions to where they can help each other raise this group of children. Whereas before you didn't even have anybody to raise the children. Whether you have one child or two or three or four, the more children that you have in a singular family unit, the harder it is to function individually and on a family scale. So when you have more kids in a singular family unit, then that actually amps up the problems that are going to happen individually and on a massive scale. Whereas when you have more people that are in that compatible union, you're going to have different access points. You're going to have a healthy selection of modes, of ways to approach a given situation. Also look at what you can do with a company or a battalion as opposed to like a squad or even a platoon of, people. What would community look like with clans, like entire clans of families, like this clan, that clan, that clan? This is why you had different clans, units like that, because there's a strength in that relationship. How many schools could you build? How many grocery stores could you build? How many different kinds of teaching styles would you have? It creates a stronger individual and it creates a stronger community. So once you take the romanticism out of it, once you take the emotion, once you take all of the fairy tale versions of the relationships that we have been sold to over the years, once you take all that out and just look at function, you'll see that there's more unhealthier functions in that singular unit as opposed to having a larger family unit, a more compatible family unit. It's also easier to break people when you just have one and one, when you have a man and a woman. Look at the divorce rate right now. It's more than 50%. When you just have a man and a woman, it just takes one of them to fuck up and the entire family has been destroyed. Look at what divorce does to families. Look at what divorce does to children. This is all a benefit to the system. You think the divorce rate across the board in this country is just a mistake? No, it's on purpose. It's being maintained. Look at what Hollywood does to women. Look at what Hollywood does to men. Look at how it affects our psyche. That's on purpose. You think that's not there's not a direct correlation between the way Hollywood promotes men and women and the divorce rate? It's a direct correlation. My question is why? What's the purpose behind that? Creating weaker individuals, weaker men, weaker women, weaker children, weaker families. This is not to say there is no strength between a man and a woman and a single family. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there's more to the story besides that. When we take the personal perspectives out of it and we look at it with a larger picture, there's more to look at when you take more things into account. So this is just something to think about. I wanted to share this with everybody because I had been thinking about it for a while now. And once I started to see the mind control based upon relationships from a tactical perspective, all of these points started to make more sense. And they started to connect to a lot of the other things I had been sharing before, specifically the depopulation programming, the eugenics programming, the evolution programming, so on and so forth, the control on a massive scale. If we are to sit back and think that relationships overall are not going to be a source of mind control and manipulation, then we're severely naive to how deep this mind control goes. If we don't ask ourselves these deeper questions without removing ourselves from the romanticism, the emotional egoic versions that are keeping us from going any further, we're only going to go so far.